Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, the podcast where we explore some of the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. I'm Jack Montgomery, and today we're traveling back to the summer of 1975, when former Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa walked into the parking lot of a suburban Detroit restaurant to attend a meeting and was never seen again. At the time, he was still a powerful and determined force within the labor movement. Over half a century later, his baffling disappearance remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American history. James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. His father, a coal miner, died when Jimmy was just 7 years old, and the loss forced his mother to relocate the family to Detroit, Michigan, in search of work. Hoffa left school at 14 and entered the workforce during the grinding years of the Great Depression. Detroit in the 1930s was a battleground of industry and labor unrest, where auto plants and freight depots powered the economy. Disputes between workers and management were often raw and confrontational. It was in this environment that Hoffa discovered his natural instinct for organization. As a young warehouse worker, he helped lead what became known as the Strawberry Boys Strike, persuading fellow workers to refuse unloading perishable cargo until management addressed their demands. The episode was modest in scale but significant in implication. Hoffa understood leverage, timing, and solidarity. He understood that power, when organized, could bend circumstances. He joined the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and rose rapidly through its ranks. Unlike some labor leaders who relied primarily on speeches, Hoffa was immersed in the mechanics of contracts and enforcement. He negotiated fiercely, often confronting employers directly and operating in a trucking industry where organized crime figures sometimes exerted influence over routes and labor supply. By the 1950s, Hoffa had established himself as one of the most formidable figures in organized labor. In October 1957, he became General President of the Teamsters. Under his leadership, the union expanded dramatically, representing hundreds of thousands of drivers, warehouse workers, and freight handlers across the country. Hoffa centralized bargaining authority and pushed for national contracts that stabilized wages and benefits across entire industries. Teamster pension funds grew in size and financial influence, giving the union not only bargaining power but economic reach. That growth, however, drew intense federal scrutiny. Throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, investigators alleged that organized crime families had infiltrated certain aspects of Teamster operations and were using union pension funds to finance ventures, including Las Vegas casino developments. Hoffa denied being controlled by the mafia, though he did not deny knowing influential figures within those circles. His most determined adversary became U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, whose pursuit of Hoffa through hearings and criminal investigations turned their rivalry into one of the defining legal battles of the era. In 1964, Hoffa was convicted in federal court on charges including jury tampering and fraud related to misuse of union funds. After years of appeals, he began serving his sentence on March 7, 1967, at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. For many public figures, imprisonment would have marked the end of influence. For Hoffa, it became a pause in an unfinished campaign. In December 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence to time served. The commutation was not a pardon, and it came with a critical condition. Hoffa was barred from participating in the direct or indirect management of any labor organization until March 6, 1980. Hoffa challenged the restriction and quickly began maneuvering to regain control of the Teamsters. By the mid-1970s, he was openly pressing for a return to leadership, attempting to rebuild alliances and reclaim authority within a union that had evolved during his absence. But by then, the labor landscape had shifted. New leadership had consolidated control, and organized crime figures who once aligned with Hoffa were reportedly comfortable with the new balance of power. A comeback effort threatened stability, financial arrangements, and long-established understandings. In that context, Hoffa's ambition may have become a liability. One summer afternoon on July 30th, 1975, Hoffa left his home in suburban Michigan and drove to the Matches Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township. He reportedly believed he was going to sit down with two men who represented both power and danger within organized labor and organized crime. Anthony Giacalone, known as Tony Jack, and Anthony Provenzano, known as Tony Pro. Giacalone was a senior figure in the Detroit crime family, a quiet but influential power broker who maintained connections between the mob and legitimate business interests throughout Michigan. He was widely viewed by federal investigators as a stabilizing presence within Detroit's underworld, someone who preferred negotiation to violence, but who wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. His long-standing ties to labor unions, including connections within the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, made him a logical intermediary for any high-level discussion about Hoffa's attempted return to union leadership. Provenzano, by contrast, had a far more volatile reputation. A capo in the Genovese crime family and a dominant force in Teamsters Local 560 in New Jersey, he had clashed bitterly with Hoffa for years. During Hoffa's time in federal prison, their relationship reportedly deteriorated into open hostility, with allegations of threats and deep personal animosity. By 1975, as Hoffa sought to reclaim the presidency of the Teamsters, Provenzano was believed to be firmly opposed to his comeback, a stance that aligned with broader organized crime interests that had grown comfortable with Hoffa's successor. Both men denied arranging a meeting with Hoffa on July 30th, and neither was ever charged in connection with his disappearance, yet their names remain permanently tied to the mystery of what happened that summer afternoon. Hoffa arrived around 2 p.m. and was seen waiting in the restaurant's parking lot. Between approximately 2:15 and 2:30 p.m., he used a payphone behind the restaurant near Damon Hardware to call his wife. He told her he had been stood up and would be home later that afternoon. That call was the last confirmed contact anyone ever had with Hoffa. Shortly thereafter, he vanished without a trace. Investigators later concluded that Hoffa likely left the parking lot between 2:45 and 2:50 p.m. There were no clear signs of a struggle at the scene, and his car remained where he had parked it. When he failed to return home that evening, his wife reported him missing, and the FBI launched one of the most extensive missing person investigations in its history. From the outset, federal authorities suspected that Hoffa had been lured into another vehicle and killed shortly thereafter. However, without a body, establishing definitive proof proved extraordinarily difficult. Agents interviewed hundreds of witnesses, subpoenaed records, conducted surveillance of known organized crime figures, and attempted to reconstruct Hoffa's final movements with minute-by-minute precision. Early working theories suggested that Hoffa was transported to a secondary location, possibly a nearby residence, where he was murdered. Subsequent accounts from informants proposed that his body was either cremated, compacted in industrial machinery, or buried in a remote location. Each theory carried elements of plausibility, yet none yielded physical confirmation. One of the most controversial figures to emerge from the Hoffa mystery was Frank Sheeran, sometimes known as the Irishman. He was a longtime labor union official who later became involved with the Teamsters, where he developed connections with powerful mob figures who influenced parts of the Union. Sheeran had known Hoffa for years, and he built a reputation as an enforcer who carried out sensitive errands on behalf of organized crime figures. Decades after Hoffa vanished, Sheeran would make a stunning claim that he himself had been the man who pulled the trigger. Sheeran did not publicly claim responsibility until the early 2000s, nearly 3 decades after Hoffa disappeared. That's when he gave a series of taped interviews to former prosecutor and author Charles Brandt. At the time, Sheeran was elderly and living in a nursing facility in Pennsylvania. He claimed that on July 30th, 1975, he lured Hoffa into a house in Detroit under the pretense of a meeting with mob figures. 2 other men were waiting inside. Sheeran claimed he shot Hoffa twice in the back of the head, and that Hoffa's body was quickly removed and later cremated. These interviews became the basis for Brandt's 2004 true crime book, I Heard You Paint Houses, which first publicly revealed Sheeran's claim. The story later reached a much wider audience through the 2019 film The Irishman. Yet many investigators remain skeptical of his confession, noting inconsistencies in the timeline and a lack of definitive forensic evidence. Critics also point out that elderly mob associates sometimes embellish their past roles in famous crimes. As a result, while Sheeran's version of events is dramatic, it remains only one of many competing explanations for what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. No charges were ever filed based on his statements. Physical searches continued across decades. In 2012, authorities excavated a driveway in Roseville, Michigan, after receiving a tip that Hoffa had been buried beneath it. No human remains were found. In 2013, the FBI searched farmland in Oakland Township based on information from a reputed organized crime figure. Again, no conclusive evidence was recovered. In 2021, investigators searched a former landfill site in New Jersey near the Pulaski Skyway after a tip suggested Hoffa's body might have been hidden inside a steel drum. That effort also failed to produce definitive results. Rumors persisted that Hoffa had been buried beneath Giant Stadium in New Jersey, encased in concrete, or destroyed within hours of his disappearance. None of those claims has been substantiated. The absence of remains has remained the central obstacle to prosecution and closure. In 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead in absentia, effective July 30th of that year. Legally, the matter closed. Historically, it did not. The endurance of the Hoffa mystery lies in its structure: a powerful man, a public setting, a narrow timeline, and a disappearance that appears almost surgical in its execution. If he was murdered, those responsible eliminated the most crucial element of any homicide investigation: the body. Without remains, prosecutors cannot establish cause of death or definitively tie individuals to a crime scene. The result is a case suspended between strong suspicion and provable fact. Hoffa spent his life negotiating power in back rooms and boardrooms, shaping the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. To some, he was a champion of working-class Americans who secured better wages and protections. To others, he symbolized corruption and blurred ethical lines. Yet regardless of perspective, his final chapter remains unwritten. Hoffa's own fate was likely decided in a quiet parking lot in a matter of minutes. Whether he was silenced to protect secrets, settle scores, or preserve an uneasy peace, one truth remains: his disappearance became larger than his life. And until we know exactly what happened that summer afternoon in 1975, the shadow of Jimmy Hoffa will continue to stretch across American history. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Echoes of the Unknown. If you found this story compelling, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with fellow mystery lovers. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the most haunting stories are sometimes the ones without endings.